I'd like to congratulate you and Asia Society for having chosen this date. It was almost as if you knew that there would be so much to discuss in this standoff, because as we well know, 2 months after the standoff began, we have taken a pause with the decision to begin a disengagement process coming out of a conversation between the Indian National Security Advisor and his counterpart, his special representative, the Foreign Minister of China. The devil, as they say, is in the details, and we are still awaiting the details of just what this disengagement and de-escalation will mean. And beyond that, there are so many questions that it will be my privilege to both hear and to put to our panelists and hear their answers on. The first, really, what caused this? What caused an unprecedented standoff? Unprecedented because the line of actual control has not seen violence in 45 years. This particular point in Galwan, in Ladakh, has not seen this kind of clash since the 1962 war. So what caused this? We've heard from the experts on everything from a Doklam revenge to Article 370's impact, to the growth of Indian infrastructure, to just plain Chinese aggression in other places as well, to China's reaction to the US-India growing partnership. We're also looking at the unanswered questions that come out of this disengagement plan. If the Chinese never transgressed, as the Indian government and the Prime Minister have said again and again, what exactly are they withdrawing from? Why are Indian troops pulling back at all, as we are told they are today? And why are we suspending patrols on the LAC? Is this all new procedure, and is that going to be a permanent thing? The real question, are we going to be able to go back to status quo ante, as in before May, where the situation was in April, or are we looking at a permanent new normal? Ambassador Rao, I'd like to come to you with the first question, really. So many precedents have been set with this particular standoff. What will be its lasting impact, do you think?
First of all, Suhasini, I think it's difficult to really draw some definite conclusions from the developments that we've heard of since yesterday, following the conversation between our NSA and the Chinese foreign minister. For one, we have very few details about what really is going to be the action on the ground. Obviously, it's going to be a very long and tortuous process. And the background to all this is the total collapse of trust between the two sides, which is a big, big drawback. Now, I notice from whatever I'm seeing in the commentariat, the media commentariat here in India, that the focus has been on Galwan, the Galwan Valley, and on hot springs. And what happens in the Pangong So area is still unclear. And as for Deksang, which was also mentioned in dispatches near Daulapegoldi, that could very well be another pressure point. So talking about the impact of what all this is going to be, at this moment, it's, as I said, very difficult to really chart a clear scenario. The fact is that what happened at Galwan on the 15th of June was definitely an inflection point. More than that, a near breaking point in the relationship. Now, if you look at the Chinese statement and the Indian statement that was released yesterday, I believe that the Chinese one is much more elaborate, much more nuanced. It hints at several underlying causes of the dispute, the rights and the wrongs of what happened in Galwan. And there's this little rather kind of hidden implication that the blame lies more with India and that China is the injured party, and that the Chinese can be expected, of course, to speak on those lines. But what the Chinese statement does is to refer to the current situation in bilateral relations as being very complex and of the need to work together to overcome and turn it around as soon as possible and to uphold the big picture in the bilateral relationship. It's interesting because they're referring to a larger picture, and what perhaps is implied thereby is that there are many more causes to what happened along the line of actual control than just a question of what the Chinese call the infrastructure arms race. It could be more than that. And I know that many observers and analysts have attributed various reasons to the Chinese activism. But it really, what the Chinese are now calling for is for a strategic assessment to be made, and a message being directed at India that you have to look at development, you have to look at the compulsions that each nation faces in terms of progress and the well-being of their population. And ominously, there is also this reference to guiding public opinion in the right direction. Here again, I think the guns are trained on India. And I think it will be a challenge when you're talking of impact and the way, our media and our public opinion reacts to these developments, and the way they draw conclusions from what has happened, whether, the reaction from on our side will be overtly jingoistic or triumphal, and how that is going to impact the Chinese reactions. So it's a very, very tangled web that surrounds us today. By no means can we say that, the fact that disengagement is going to happen and the troops are going to, draw back, whether this is going to solve the problem, one can really not say what the impact is going to be on the bilateral relations. At this moment, they have headed really south. And the situation along the line of actual control, there's no guarantee that yesterday's or day before yesterday's conversation is really going to help matters. As far as the Indian statement is concerned, it looks like the Indians are focusing basically on the disengagement process, about strictly respecting and observing the LAC, although the Chinese also talk about the need to effect a complete disengagement process, even if they don't talk about the LAC. But what matters, obviously, most to the Indian side is to try and diffuse the situation. Obviously, there has been a crisis staring us right in the face. But will the zone of disengagement be spelt out clearly? Will it be ensured that the troops of the two sides don't come up against each other? Can we be sure that there will be no further confrontation? So that's where we are at the moment, Suhasini.
It's interesting that you speak about the specific differences in the statements. In fact, when you say that the Galwan clash is something that China made a specific reference to and said it's very clear what the rights and wrongs are, we understand that CGTN put out an entire documentary carrying what it called these visuals of Indian troops at Galwan, and clearly making the point that they felt they were the victims of this peace. I'd like to come to you, Professor Taylor Fravel, next. You've, of course, studied Chinese military strategy, and it is important for us to look at really not just what led to this particular standoff, given that it comes just 3 years after the last crisis in Doklam, but really, is this disengagement going to end the Chinese aggression at the LAC? Is there a sense that China is backing off now, having met Indian mettle, as it were?
Thanks so much, Suhasini, and thanks to Asia Society for having me here today. That's a terrific question. I mean, my view of the disengagement really is simply a conflict management or crisis management procedure to ensure that the violence that occurred on the sort of evening of June 15th does not repeat itself again. There's no indication in these statements that, for example, there's any agreement on sort of where troops ought to be deployed, where the line of actual control actually resides, and so forth. And so I take a very narrow view of what is happening. I think it's very positive. I don't want to downplay the fact that it's very important to prevent another clash from occurring, and that does require separating troops, and that does require putting in place protocols for how they interact, but that does not sort of address the sort of higher level diplomatic and sort of political considerations that would have to be addressed subsequently. Let me also make just a few observations about what has happened, which also I think sort of bears on your question. First, right, China sees sort of the border with India as what sort of Chinese military strategy describes as a secondary strategic direction. In other words, right, China's main security concern is not actually India, it's the United States. And sort of the center of gravity for Chinese military strategy is not its southwest or the border with India, but in fact sort of the east of China and the Western Pacific. And so I think this means that when on the one hand, China wants stability on the border with India, defined primarily as sort of maintaining its advantageous position, it also doesn't want to allocate too many military forces to the border with India. And so I think it's been quite sensitive to what it views, at least from Beijing's standpoint, right, as kind of Indian challenges or provocations. And so that sort of, I think, helps us understand the paradox here. On the one hand, China's been quite forceful in asserting itself along the line of actual control, but on the other hand, I think there is a sense they don't want to take it further now. The second point I wanted to make refers to the statement that Ambassador Rao described. I have just a slightly sort of different interpretation or a few points to add here. First, although it does certainly cast China as the victim, it does so in a very sort of muted way compared to previous statements. And so I read that as, on the one hand, something that China felt it would have to say, given its previous statements. But on the other hand, they really spent most of the time focusing on sort of this bigger picture of China-India relations. And, one quote here is the ambassador mentioned, right, to jointly uphold the big picture of China-India relations. And I view this really as signaling a desire to go back to the way things were. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but if we want to try to understand Chinese intent, I think from sort of the Chinese perspective, the territorial dispute was sort of isolated from the rest of the relationship, more or less, for the last 2 decades. And I think that served Chinese interests well in terms of developing ties with India and other areas. And so I read this statement really as very much signaling at the diplomatic and political levels, China does not want to escalate any further and would in fact like to go back to the way things were. Well, again, that may not be what happens, but I think that is one way of kind of reading the overarching emphasis in this document as to sort of the importance of the broader bilateral relationship for development and revitalization. Anyway, I'll end there. I'm sure there's much more we could talk about, and thank you.
Sure, and it's important that, the distinction you've made that this is a conflict management kind of decision, and the other is that China is not looking to escalate this with India in particular. That's fairly interesting because so much of the narrative and the experts we've heard from have been speaking about China's across-the-board aggression, but what you seem to be suggesting is that this is not a fight China wants to pick in some major way and would rather, talk about how the bigger picture is more important. Could I come to you, Tanvi Madan, next? And, in your book, you had spoken about, there's this very interesting phrase where you said that the US-India partnership as a counter to China is neither inevitable nor impossible. It is not impossible that it could counter China, but it is not inevitable either. Do you think the India-US relationship played a part in what we saw in terms of maybe sparking the standoff, but also in helping resolve it?
Thanks, Suhasini. I think, one of the things that the US angle to me is interesting, but it's like a number of the debates that people are having about motivations, which is, my answer is we don't know. We don't know that it played a role. There's some speculation, of course, that this was a message to India that India shouldn't get closer to the US, though the end result might be exactly the opposite. It would be counterproductive in terms of pushing India towards the US. I have even seen people in India who normally say India shouldn't get closer to the US, saying this is the option India should take. China has forced our hands. And so, yes, it could be one, but that's not, I still find it hard to believe that is kind of either the primary factor, because there are enough others that are more convincing. But the other thing is, there are others who pointed out that essentially this is, they've argued, I think Yun Sun has been one of the people who's written about this, which is that China has decided that in any case, India is going to move towards the US, or already has. So, it doesn't really matter if we do this, and it won't push India make India do anything it wasn't going to do anyway. But then I've also heard others who've argued to me in the past, both Chinese officials and analysts, who've said to me that, look, India, they almost depend on Indian strategic autonomy. It's almost like an umbrella that, we can push, but there's only that far India will go with the US. So it's not going to happen. I think kind of there is, I think, still much debate on Chinese motivations. Taylor has written about this. Others have, including why we're seeing this pattern of assertiveness across the board. There are lots of local conditions in each case, obviously, but there is something to be said about the fact that in these last few weeks alone, forget last few months and put the US aside, we've seen kind of more airspace intrusions into Taiwan, more activity near the Senkakus, South China Sea, more assertiveness, including ramming kind of Vietnamese fishing vessels, and that might be even if it's the maritime militia nonetheless. We've seen the Aussies being pushed, the Australians kind of being pushed, whether that's with kind of unnamed cyber attacks from unnamed state actors or kind of economic coercion. We've seen Canadian think tankers being kind of charged formally, and the China going ahead with that prosecution. Not to mention now kind of new claims, territorial claims vis-a-vis Bhutan, though those might be linked with kind of either trying to send a signal to India or put pressure on the kind of India-Bhutan relationship. Nonetheless, we are seeing this pattern. Taylor's talked about some reasons in terms of insecurities, the need to show strength as a reason. But to me, there really is something we need to think about what's going on. Why are motivations important? Because that can help you tell you, how you can get out of it. But just, briefly on the statements in terms of the current moment we're at, to me, the Indian and Chinese readouts from the Wang Yi Ajit Doval call were quite different in terms of substance, tone, and emphasis. And I saw the Indian statement as being directed at wanting to restore the status quo ante or restoring peace and tranquility at the border, and that being the emphasis, and the Chinese statement as being wanting to restore the relationship. Essentially, let's go back to business as usual. This is all kind of put the border relationship in its own box, put it in the right place, as they said, let's move on with other things. And I think, if you're thinking about implications, to me, that's where I think you will see the implications, which is, something I think former Foreign Secretary Sham Saran mentioned, alluded to in an article you wrote, co-authored, Suhasini, with Anand Krishnan today, that tensions might subside, but the relationship is forever changed. And I think that's where I think it's going to be very hard to put these things in a separate box. That had been the idea behind this web of architecture of agreements and protocols that many Indian and Chinese diplomats have worked on over the years, over a 20-year period. But clearly, at least the Indian side sees that as not being sufficient, and in some cases as those agreements having been violated. The level of trust is low. So I think you've already seen some impact in terms of sentiment, in terms of level of trust. That does not mean India will not engage with China, but I think the nature, extent, and expectations of that engagement will change. You've already seen, just finally, a hardening of not just rhetoric in the Indian government, but also policies. So are they going to reverse them? Or have we now seen India making a decision about particularly the technology and telecom sector that will not be reversed? So I think in some ways, you've already seen implications, and perhaps we might see more in the future.
Yeah, in fact, I do want to take just that question to one of the diplomats that you spoke about, since we have her on the show. But Tanvi, if I could ask you, it was interesting for us because at the Hindu, we were reviewing your book just as the standoff began. And some of the parallels just were, it was a coincidence, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence. For example, the fact that, these clashes began in a certain way in Ladakh, that the Prime Minister made certain statements to begin with, said there is nothing at all. Finally, Jawaharlal Nehru says, I have given orders to have the Chinese troops evicted. The fact that there was a visit by US President, a joint rally with the Indian Prime Minister just months before. There were so many of these things leading up to the 1962 war. Was there a point in the standoff where you thought actually things were going to get out of control and that a limited sort of escalation was on the cards?
I think, one of the things that is there are so many, echoes in some ways, but there are an equal number of differences from the late 50s and the 60s. And I think, one of the things you see is one thing that I think has been different for the last many years has been this architecture of agreements. It did not exist in many ways during the 50s. These kind of protocols at the border, rules about carrying arms, etc., protocols on how to deal with standoff situations. Having said that, I think what June 15th showed is that you can have all these agreements and yet these things can still escalate. And so that's why I think it brings the agreements, these boundary agreements have been the basis for the two countries to move forward, to essentially not let the boundary conflict spill into other aspects of the relationship. But I think now that these very agreements that is part of what made this situation different from the 50s and 60s are also not working. That's clear from what happened on June 15th. They've helped in terms of getting to this dialogue point. These dialogues and mechanisms are still being used, but they've not proven to be sufficient. So they need to be relooked at now with a much lower level of trust. But I think there are a number of other things that are very different from the 50s, including the fact that, both countries now have independent deterrence. And hopefully, yes, it's not like India and Pakistan haven't fought limited wars under the nuclear shadow, but I think the threshold for India and China is, one hopes, much higher in that front. And so there is that deterrent. One can hope that it actually works. But I think June 15 should be a warning. These things cannot be you might hope they don't get out of control. And I don't think when China moved its forces in early May, or if it's late April, that it expected it to get this far.
Okay, that's an interesting point, that this was not considered, because, the Ministry of External Affairs, in one of its statements after the Galwan clash, said this was premeditated. Ambassador Rao, if I could come to you with exactly what Tanvi just spoke about. She spoke about the fact that diplomats have worked on these protocols. And when we say, there's been no violence of this sort in 45 years. Actually, what is most shocking is this is the first time since 1993, and the agreement on maintenance of peace and tranquility, then the protocols in 96, the protocols, I think, in 2003, 2006, 2013, it goes on. This is the first time, despite all those protocols, that we've seen this kind of violence. Would you say that there was some aspect to it which was unexpected, some aspect to it which was premeditated? And really, does it mean that each of these protocols now actually may have to be cast aside and we have to start from scratch, not just update what we had in 2012 with the border coordination mechanism?
Just unmute myself. Yeah, I thought I had muted myself. Suhasini, even without those bilateral protocols and agreements being in place from 1993 onwards, let's not forget that from 1975 until 1993, and that too, even after the Sundarong-Chu crisis, which began in 1986, we hadn't reached a point as we did at Galwan on June 15th. So, I think you have to look outside the protocols. The protocols and the agreements reached from 1993 onwards, I think, are fairly elaborate and quite in-depth in terms of the arrangements they sought to put in place to maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas or in the areas along the line of actual control. So I don't believe the fault lies there. The fault really lies, I believe, in the fact that increasingly, especially over the last 5 to 6 years, the levels of activity in terms of patrolling from both sides have gone up significantly, especially as you have seen in the Western sector and, for example, even in the Sikkim sector. I'm not talking of what happened at Doklam. And we don't have a mutually clarified line of actual control. In fact, the other day I heard somebody saying that, each side has a line of perception and those perceptions differ. And that has been proven quite graphically with what happened at Galwan. So as both sides have become increasingly able to improve infrastructure, reach up to the areas along the line of actual control, perhaps even change their limits of patrolling. I don't have details, but that's another aspect I believe that a question mark hovers over. So you've had India and China increasingly rubbing up against each other. And that leads to this kind of confrontation. And in the background of all this, you have a China that is risen, a China that is assertive, a China that I believe has a bloated sense of self, a China that is not willing to cede even an inch, and is willing to give India a fierce response for various reasons. I don't want to go into that. On the Indian side also, there is the felt need to protect your territory. You've seen what our political leaders have said about, not ceding an inch, being prepared to die for the Aksai Chin, for instance. I think with a neighbor like China, who I believe is increasingly insecure about what everybody else is doing against China, and India has unfortunately been included in that circle of countries identified as being, taking a rather, antagonist view about China. All these things coupled together, see what you've seen along the line of actual control. I don't believe the fault lies in the agreements, and in fact, the Chinese statement refers to the agreements in terms of the understandings that were reached between Mr. Doval and Mr. Wang Yi. So I think we have to look beyond that, and the more that we have this kind of heightened activity along the line of actual control, the pockets of difference are going to be accentuated much, much more. And I'm afraid the negative is going to be accentuated in the process too.
Right. It's interesting, as a scholar of China, as well as the ambassador there, former foreign secretary, when so much of this was discussed, is your sense that India needs to reanalyze its assumptions about China? Do you think that there is a gap in our diplomatic conscience, if you like, or consciousness of where China is today?
Well, I think we have summed up what the Chinese are about at this point of time. But what I'd like to say is that post-Galwan, despite the agreements that have been reached between the two special representatives, the dynamics and the rules of engagement have changed drastically. And this is a real turning point in the bilateral relationship. I referred to the breakdown of trust. And I believe that the entire edifice of bilateral relations that we built post-1988 has really been shaken at the foundations. And coming in the midst of the pandemic, this conflagration couldn't have been worse. And apart from that, China has a huge image problem in India today. The popular sentiment, the popular imagination is arraigned against China.
It's interesting. And then the fact that China mentioned in its statements that the government must try to guide the people's sentiments in this means that China has taken note of the clear shift in public anger, in the clear shift in public sentiment towards China. Professor Fravel, what was the sort of view of this entire standoff from DC? We've seen certain things from the US, I should say. We've seen certain rather puzzling statements made right at the beginning. US President Trump came out and said, I had a conversation about the situation with China. It's a bad situation. We're happy to mediate. India straight away came back and said, actually, there was no such conversation. A week later, Prime Minister Modi and US President Trump actually had the conversation. They discussed China, and India made it very clear that this was going to be something they dealt with bilaterally. As the standoff wore on, however, I think we did see, not official narrative, of course, but a lot of the commentariat suddenly talk about the possible role of the United States in this standoff. And then we heard from Secretary of State Pompeo almost suggesting, it's unclear, even though I've read the transcript a few times, almost suggesting that the US was going to pick up its troops from Germany, where they were planning to scale down, and move them in some way to deal with the theater of conflict between India and China. Now, these are puzzling statements because they're being made in public, and yet, these would represent massive shifts, whether it is with India or whether it is with the US. So give us a sense of what the view from Washington was through this entire standoff and how this disengagement will now be viewed?
Sure, thank you. I mean, let me make a couple of points. I'm sure Tanvi has even more to say on the view from Washington, given where she resides. So I'll provide the armchair Cambridge, Massachusetts view from Washington, which is the following. Basically, right, the view from Washington is that President Trump is desperately trying to get reelected at a time the economy is tanking, and we're either seeing the second part of a first wave or a second wave of corona infections that have reached record numbers every day for the last 7 to 10 days, right? In other words, foreign policy is not a priority for this administration now. And to the degree it focuses on foreign policy, I think India kind of falls somewhat far down, farther down than perhaps some people want. And there is certainly a lot of emphasis on China and confrontation with China and strategic competition with China. And to the degree that India becomes a part of it, I think it weaves itself into the sort of Washington debate. But this is an administration that at best is conducting improvisational diplomacy right now. It's just shooting from the hip. So you have Trump's statement that you mentioned. Sure, I'll mediate, without necessarily talking to anyone. And I'm probably pretty sure that China and India could agree that would be a bad idea, right? And they can't agree on much, but they could agree on that. Then you have Pompeo's statement, which was really off the cuff in the sense he was trying to rationalize why troops were going to be withdrawn from Germany, and was just sort of referencing the issue of the day without any sort of real strategic thought behind it. And after all, the Secretary of State wouldn't be one to comment on military deployments, right? That would be something that is the purview of the Secretary of Defense. And so I didn't view that necessarily as anything more than trying to sort of make sense of what was in the United States a very unpopular decision to withdraw troops from a longstanding ally, which has been Germany, especially in light of concerns that other Americans have about Russia, right? And so all that being said, I would say certainly there is a view among many in Washington that India provides an opportunity for deepening relations and a way of sort of counterbalancing against China, especially on China's sort of southwestern frontier. And this has been a view that's been around, I think, for several decades. It's not necessarily come to fruition, but I think certainly this border clash, right, creates a strong rationale for perhaps an opportunity from Washington's perspective to further improve that relationship, building upon the gains that have been made in the last 5 years or so. But I think whether or not that will happen in the next 6 months, I'm sort of quite skeptical. There may be greater sort of efforts at the working levels among the defense ministries, but at the political and diplomatic level, this administration is now totally consumed with events that are domestic in nature, and that I think will come at the expense of American sort of diplomacy around the world, including in South Asia.
And yet, we did see those reports of the U.S. warships or U.S. aircraft carriers floating into the Indo-Pacific with the sort of promise that they would in some way be would help in defraying some of the challenge to India. Do you think that was overblown?
I mean, the two carriers that are in the South China Sea this week, appear to be, especially given the sort of publicity that the Defense Department has attached to them, to counteract the perception created a few months ago when there was an outbreak of the coronavirus on the Teddy Roosevelt, and that the sense that the U.S. was weakened. And the Global Times kind of ran with this, and I'm not a fan of the Global Times for many reasons, but it did capture the attention of some in the Pentagon. So there's this sense that we have to show that we're back. So we're showing we're back by having two carriers operate with a B-52 bomber flying from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and you have planes from the carriers and all of this. And, yes, it's a show that the U.S. Still sort of cares about sort of what's happening in the region and is still present, but I wouldn't necessarily view it as reflecting a deeper change in policy. Now, of course, the United States has always been focused in the last few years on China and East Asia in particular, so that sort of choice of location was not surprising to me. But I don't think it's necessarily a sign that, in the coming months, the U.S. is going to take a militarily more confrontational view or stance towards China, but they did want to counteract this perception that somehow the U.S. had been weakened by the pandemic and had withdrawn from the region and was sort of less able to project power in the region. And everything in the last 6 months, or last 3 months, including using littoral combat ships to visit Malaysian drilling rigs. There was a picture last week of a littoral combat ship sort of monitoring a Chinese survey vessel within Vietnamese waters. And so there's this clear sense that they want to sort of create a perception, a sort of a U.S. perception of presence and strength.
Not to mention all the Twitter back and forth we've seen between them. Tanvi, can I bring you in on exactly the same question, really? When it comes to the view from Washington, it seemed as if there was different messages coming at different times. Did you see the reasons for them as different from what Professor Fravel said?
I've actually seen a fairly kind of consistent message in some ways. I'm setting aside the mediation offer, which I don't think there is a dispute that President Trump has seen that he doesn't want to mediate. And as Taylor pointed to, the Chinese more bluntly and India more diplomatically declined that offer. Setting that aside, I think you've seen, in fact, from early May, kind of mid-May onwards, before the clash at Galwan itself, but since the standoff, you've seen administration officials make statements that essentially have pointed to this as an example of broader Chinese assertiveness, for one. And you've seen this now not just from the administration, but from members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. For example, Eliot Engel, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who's a Democrat, said this about the boundary standoff before, saying this is aggressive, this is China bullying. It's another instance of China bullying its neighbors. And so, to me, a lot of people in Washington, and particularly government officials or members of Congress, are seeing this as that broader pattern of assertiveness. I was on a House Intelligence Committee hearing the other day, and there were Democrats on there because the Republicans didn't show up for it, but almost there was a consensus that this was something wrong, and there's something worrying about what China is doing. So I think it was seen very much as part of that. Second, I would say what you've seen is the US, frankly, being far more supportive of India and critical of China than any other country. The only other country that's really kind of criticized the Chinese move has been the Japanese. The Japanese ambassador saying, this, we don't like unilateral changes to the status quo. But others have. So I think in some ways you've seen the diplomatic support. We've seen reports that the US has shared intelligence with India, the kind of agreements that have been signed over the mechanisms of cooperation developed over the last 10 or so years, and particularly the last few years. This is where they're bearing fruit. And you've seen signals, and from what we've heard, reports that essentially the US has said they will take their lead from India. So initially you did see the Indian government saying we don't want the US to say very much for the reasons we talked about earlier, that they didn't want this to be seen as part of US-China competition, become a geopolitical football. And there were clear signals from Delhi, please don't say very much. That changed after the June 15th incident. And we've seen the Indian ambassador here be very active in especially briefing members of Congress, who then subsequently, in fact, come out and gone further than even the administration in terms of calling it premeditated, unlawful aggression, etc. So I think in many ways, because of the mood on China, it's not necessarily to do with India, but the mood on China, which has got more concerned, you have seen at least one consistency that you're not seeing too much. Taylor might have a different view, but you're not really seeing China's narrative catch on too much in a way that it might have a few years ago.
And this is also post-pandemic. But then if I could just push you on that a little more. If it was, in fact, a situation where India would need the US assistance, what would that be?
So it's interesting, right? Because I think here you have the US that has different imperatives. On the one hand, wanting to point to this as Chinese assertiveness, but also and wanting to show support for a country that it's been courting. Having said that, there's a very real fact that by India's choice, India is not a traditional formal ally to whom the US has security commitments or obligations. Having said that, what we've seen, and this is what we've seen in the past, some of which I've covered in my book, but also we've seen it even in 2017 and in other crises. How could the US help potentially? What could those asks be? It could be, for example, diplomatic support in international organizations. It could be expediting of certain military equipment or supplies. It could be additional intelligence sharing. Could it go even further than that in terms of military capabilities? Perhaps, but then there will need to be a debate here. And I suspect what is happening here is that they are thinking through, because this is something the system does, they will think through different contingencies of where this might go. One thing I think the system here should be doing, if they're not already, which is in each of those cases thinking what the Indian ask could be, whether the US would be willing to provide it, and to ensure that then the US is prepared. Now, one of the things that will be a question for the US and India going ahead, given that they have interoperability is increased, but there are things like joint contingency planning that have not happened as far as I know, is I don't know that there are better mechanisms today, interestingly, than there were in 1962 when India suddenly needed help for the US to be able to deliver this support. But those mechanisms aren't exactly fully fledged. And so there will be some hiccups along the way. And one question ahead will be whether it's at a track 2 basis, track 1.5, track 1, is it something the US and India, without an alliance, nobody's talking about an alliance here, US isn't offering one, India doesn't want one, should there be those kind of discussions about scenarios and contingencies and what those might require?
Okay, if I could quickly take that to you, Ambassador Rao, and I know we've got a lot of audience questions, so I'll go to them next. But yet, despite everything Tanvi said about the gaming of what the US and India could do together if they were to try and counter China's challenge, the Indian instinct, if you like, or New Delhi's instinct has been to actually reach out to Russia. The defense minister made a rare visit during the pandemic to Moscow to discuss the S-400. The external affairs minister became a part of the Russia, India, China trilateral just days after the Galwan incident. My question really is, what exactly is the message that is going out from there? And I will add that today the US State Department has actually put out a reminder to say, please remember that we have concerns over CATSA. So India's asking to expedite the S-400 delivery of those systems has clearly ruffled some feathers in Washington. So what is the message that New Delhi was putting out there?
Suhasini, the more things change, I think the more they are the same. I think the questions, the strategic dilemmas facing India have not changed very much just because Galwan has happened. I know there is an instinctive move to reach out to the United States, to align ourselves much more closely with the United States. But ultimately, when it comes to facing China on our northern borders, how much, are these relationships really going to make a difference? It's true in the defense and security sphere. The kind of closeness we've developed with the United States is so much more tangible and real and useful to us than it ever was or was at the time of 1962. But in terms of our, requirements at this point of time, we will obviously have to source both from Russia and the United States, and that is obviously why the defense minister was in Moscow, and what he has and the agreements or the understandings arrived at there may not exactly be palatable to the United States. And this is the dilemma that we are going to constantly face. When it comes to, we obviously have rooted ideas about our own security, and we would not, most people in India would not like the US to really commandeer us in this sphere. They would like the US to support us, no doubt, but not to be commandeered by the United States. So we don't want to obviously be boxed into a corner as far as that is concerned. But I'd like to allude to another point, Suhasini, in terms of the kind of hesitation or the extreme caution that we have tended to display when it comes to our dealings with the US vis-a-vis China, or when it comes, let's say, to the Quad, or what we do in terms of the Malabar exercises. I think we will continue to be quite sensitive to what the Chinese reactions will be. I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but did the Prime Minister send a birthday message to the Dalai Lama yesterday? My understanding
No, he didn't, in fact.
He did not. So there is obviously this kind of, we tend to be, we have this kind of double vision, I think, on this issue. And when we're going to get rid of it, I can't say.
And I feel guilty that we've gotten through nearly this entire hour without discussing the Tibet question and whether India should be looking much more closely at what I don't like the term Tibet card, but should India actually be looking at it? But this is one of the questions that has come, so I'll put it to you, and let's just go through some of the questions the audience has set in. So Ambassador Rao, if I could come to you with the first one that says, essentially, should India, do you think the incursion was planned? Okay. Do you think India should change its position regarding One China?
No, I don't think that is realistic or feasible. I don't believe we can change our One China policy, and there's really no need to change it. I don't think knee-jerk reactions of that sort really would fit into the larger scheme of what we would like to do in terms of diplomacy and in terms of long-term policy alternatives. It's true that with Taiwan, there are many more options of trying to develop, a closer interaction. Taiwan is the only Chinese democracy, as some people have called it, in the region. And there is, again, I don't believe we should hesitate in exploring the various options to develop a closer dialogue and interaction across the gamut with Taiwan. It need not amount to recognition of Taiwan as, so-called Republic of China or, the doppelganger to the People's Republic. I don't believe we need to do that, but we need to explore those options. But no, I wouldn't suggest dropping the One China policy.
All right, interesting. Professor Fravel, two questions for you. One is, do you think this incursion was planned by a local PLA commander, or did this come from the top? The second question from Akriti Vasudev, who asks, with China showing aggression on multiple fronts, the South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, Bhutan as well now, is Beijing not worried about being overextended?
Great, thank you. So first, clearly Chinese moves up to the LAC in Galwan, Pangong Lake, and other areas were centrally planned from the very top. You can't move Chinese forces of that size without authority, basically, of the Central Military Commission. As for the clash on the evening of June 15th, I don't know. My intuition is that it was a local situation that escalated and got out of control. It would surprise me if China did decide to sort of plan that from the top. So I think it was a product of the face-off, the disengagement agreement, and other factors. But I'm not sure we will ever know with respect to the sort of the events on June 15th. To the second question, I think China is at a risk of overextending itself. I think on the one hand, it believes it is acting to sort of defend various core sort of interests relating to questions of sovereignty. So it's not a surprise to me that where we're seeing all the tension with China, whether it's East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, Hong Kong, or Tibet, right? These are all areas on China's immediate periphery where it believes its sovereignty is at stake. And given all of the criticism China is facing for the culpability of the pandemic, the economic decline in China that the pandemic has created, and so forth, I think Chinese leaders have decided that they can't afford to appear weak on questions of sovereignty. So that would sort of explain why China might be doing what it's doing, but I think it's having a sort of the effect of creating a common perception, as Tanvi mentioned earlier, right, of a much more assertive and belligerent China across the board and on many fronts at the same time, even if those are relating to questions of sovereignty. And that at least certainly creates sort of a common cause among others in the region, although I think sort of the shared concerns about China were already there. They're just more evident. So this brings me back to sort of my opening remark. I see, at least with India and the statement yesterday, and the fact that Wang Yi and NSA Doval met as an effort basically to sort of arrest a further decline of China-India relations with respect to this particular issue. And I suspect, although I don't know, that maybe over the summer and into the fall, we might see sort of a moderate Chinese recalibration in this regard. But I think it's very hard for them dealing with sort of the party dealing with criticism at home for its handling of the pandemic, the economic situation, the decline in U.S.-China relations that really accelerated in the last few months, and sort of what it sort of views as pressure on these sovereignty issues. So we may be in some sort of a Greek tragedy, and on the other hand, situation could also just get worse. We'll have to watch and see.
But you're making the point that this could be one of the reasons we're seeing the kind of calming of temperature. Can I take these two questions to you, Tanvi? Shariar Afzal is asking, given the billions of dollars in trade and hundreds of companies operating in each other's countries, could either side even contemplate a limited war, just given the economic stakes? And the second question, do you think the scrapping of Article 370 and India's statements on POK and Aksai Chin played a part in triggering the clashes?
Sure. I mean, I genuinely don't think either side wants war. I think the Chinese, to the extent they had goals in terms of, essentially making their claims real or establishing a presence where they feel they have claims, wanted to do it as a fait accompli and present India with that. And either you negotiate, the 2 steps forward, 1 step back at the table, or you think India, I don't know why they would think that, given that India has resisted and kind of in 2013, 2014, and 2017 when it involved Bhutan, that you think, okay, India might not actually push back. And so, I don't think either side wants war. But countries often get into wars not wanting them. So I think, that is something to keep in mind. I don't think that is the end goal. It's not something either side, frankly, can afford, given the consequences of the pandemic, health and economic on both sides. But that's, these things are not necessarily always intended. On 370, I think it's one of various motivations. I'm not convinced it's the motivation. Is it kind of one of the ones that has fed in? Perhaps. There's the view that the India didn't get what the Chinese were saying. Foreign Minister Jaishankar went and briefed them. There were multiple occasions at which they talked after. It's also possible that it did feed in, and there's that India didn't intend it to be about China. Whatever the Home Minister might have said in Parliament, but China read it that way. I'm more I'll go back to what the official Chinese statement said, that if you're thinking about a kind of a proximate cause that's related to the boundary, it's the infrastructure building. That is what they have said themselves. The two things that the Chinese officially have said is, one, the infrastructure building, and second, they have said this is territory that we claim, and we have always claimed in the case of Galwan. So I think, I'm not sure we will ever know, and we'll be debating, we're still debating 1962, though there have been some convincing explanations, but I would just say that, throw this one into the pot. I'm less convinced than some others are, but, I have nothing to prove that it didn't factor in.
Sure. In fact, we talk so much about what are the reasons for inscrutable Chinese actions, but actually there are also the questions being asked about what India is doing and whether that should be read differently. We're running towards the end of this, so I do want to end on a slightly maybe more futuristic question about where you do think these things are going. And if I may be provocative, also ask the question, do you think we can go back to some of the initiatives we have seen between India and China over the last few years? One of them was certainly the informal summit between the two leaders. So my question really would be, do you see India now being able to walk back to some of those post-Doklam initiatives? Do you see China actually wanting to maybe go back to improving ties with India regardless of the India-US equation? And thirdly, do you see the US actually taking a greater interest in somehow being a part of the counter to China when it comes to, there have been suggestions made about US troops and Japanese troops perhaps being much more in the Indian Ocean, where China is making its own forays, perhaps working out of a base like the Andamans. There have been suggestions, of course, which we hear every year, about the militarization of the Quad. So if I could just go quickly around with all the panelists and get a sense of what you see, maybe just one or two, as the long-term impacts of the standoff that we have just witnessed.
Do you want me to start?
If we could start with Ambassador Rao and then we just go around.
Okay, I'll just take a minute. Now, on the military front, I think we'll have to stay on guard. The situation is very fragile, even tenuous. Diplomatically, keep our channels open with China, but at the same time, obviously, seek possibilities of closer convergence with friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific, where China is clearly seeking to improve strategic advantage for itself through naval outreach and construction of ports and facilities. We know that. And all these have clear military potential. So we need to leverage our assets in the Indian Ocean region particularly better. In terms of informal summits, I think the next couple of months are still going to be a period of some diplomatic sulk on both sides. I don't believe we're going to see informal summits. We'll have to see how the situation develops on the ground, whether the disengagement holds, and let's hope for the best.
All right. Interesting, because when you speak about the informal summits, one has to remember that although this figure has been given out that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi met 18 times in the last 6 years, there wasn't one conversation between the two leaders in the last 2 months of the crisis. Professor Fravel, your thoughts?
Great, thank you. I would say in terms of the sort of China-India relations, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, China would like to go back to the way things were to some degree. How that will happen, though, certainly is hard to say, and it requires efforts by both sides. I think it's also important to remember it's July the 7th, at least here in the United States. As a student of the 1962 war, I'm reminded that we have a lot of runway left for mischief to happen on the border. And so while it would certainly benefit both sides to de-escalate and to prevent the recurrence of conditions that led to a clash on the 15th, it will take a lot of hard work. And the campaign season in the Himalayas still has many months left. And so we have to watch that space closely. In terms of U.S. China U.S.-India cooperation, I suspect it will mostly occur in the maritime domain, as you mentioned, and not with respect to the situation on the border. That may sort of create some leverage for India, perhaps, on the border, but it also, I think, creates a very fine line for India to walk in terms of how much it wants to be associated with sort of the U.S. confrontational approach to China, and that may or may not be something that India wants to sort of hitch its wagon to, so to speak. But I could see a lot of low-level, quiet cooperation in the maritime domain, because that is an area where the United States, India, Japan, and many other countries, I think, have a common interest in keeping the seas free and open. And so if there is to be cooperation, my hunch, it might be witnessed there first, but I suspect it will be relatively quiet. Thank you.
All right. And Tanvi, if I could come to you and also quickly get in a question from the audience who asked, what about, why is India changing its messaging in a sense? We have the External Affairs Minister really put forth India's vision up till now, and then we suddenly have the talks with China being conducted by the National Security Advisor instead. Do you think that there is a sense in India that they need to, communicate differently, if you like, and to the larger question on what you think is going to happen ahead?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of the larger question, to me, India's kind of approach towards managing China has had three elements. Engaging with China, internal balancing, which is building Indian capabilities, and third, external balancing, which is to build a network of partnerships that also don't just help balance China, but help India build capabilities. I think you will see changes perhaps in each. There might be in extent, there might be in nature, but I think you will see some change. And what I would like to see, and I think even Indian partners would like to see, is a lot more focus and implementation on that middle one, internal balancing, which is building capabilities, which also solves India's problems of not worrying about, whether or not President Trump is reliable, or whether or not the Russians, who are very friendly with the Chinese these days, will actually not disrupt supplies. So you reduce your own dependence by building your own capabilities. That's what you use partnerships for. And that's not just military capabilities. Underlying that is building economic capabilities. This is going to be hard, particularly in a COVID atmosphere. Just on the question of communications. Look, I think in some ways, some of the assumptions built into, especially when there's media management vis-a-vis China, have been because of lessons learned in the run-up to 62. They are things that the government has done for many years. One of the things I think does need to be factored in is this, real-time kind of social media effort. Government might not like it, but it exists. It creates narratives. It creates sometimes maybe not fake news, but wrong information. It needs to be tackled. That needs to be factored in while keeping in mind that these are sensitive issues that need a certain amount of discretion to be able to have some negotiating flexibility. So I think that needs to be factored in. I wouldn't make too much of I think in terms of the NSA, I think that was because that's who is the special representative for India as part of the boundary question. And that is the kind of mechanisms that has been used. One thing I would say is I do think, this is something I think governments need to be careful about, which is it's one thing wanting to send a message to your political base. But at the end of the day, that cannot take priority over the message that is important from an Indian kind of a national interest perspective. And so I think that needs to be the focus. And yes, politicians are always going to factor in politics, but I think in terms of thinking about the audience, it has to take priority, that it has to be primarily in terms of the objective, who's your primary audience. It has to be about kind of thinking about what is going to get you India's objectives and not necessarily, win you the next election.
Sure, say great takeaways. One cannot be a house divided when one is dealing with these conflicts. I think we've completely run out of time here, but what a fascinating hour it has been. Clearly from everything all of you are saying is that status quo ante back to April when it comes to the ground is going to be a difficult proposition, but status quo ante when it comes to the relationship may be much, much harder. And that's something that we will all be tracking in a sense. So I'd just like to thank Tanvi Madan, Taylor Fravel, Nirupama Rao for joining us. And I will hand back to Asia Society. And thank you to the Asia Society for making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Suhasini.